MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Shalom, everyone. Welcome back to the MessianTics podcast. This is Rabbi Toby, and I'm here with Rabbi David and Rabbi Eric and Rabbi Jonathan. And we're starting this episode like we do occasionally with some, as in it's kind of in medias res, as in we started a really good conversation and we just decided to hit record. Sometimes we discuss things beforehand and we say, okay, this is what we're talking about, and we hit record after planning it. But sometimes we just sit down and we start talking. Sometimes we haven't talked in a few days and we just kind of gears start turning and we just go, hey, stop, let's hit record. And what we were talking about before we hit record, this spontaneous conversation, was about the book of Romans and the things that Paul addresses. Rabbi David and I were on the way here this morning and we were listening to Rabbi Jacob Rosenberg, and he was talking about how amazing the book of Romans is and why it's so amazing. It's one of my personal favorite letters that Paul writes because he addresses so many things. And there are things in the Bible, and this is, again, we're speaking from a messianic perspective. There are things in the Bible, especially when we get into the New Testament, because it is in the New Testament. It's in the New Testament where we really start to see the prophecies that God made about the nations coming to him. Those things come into fruition in the New Covenant on a writ large scale. We have all these Gentiles coming in, which God said nations will come, right? As soon as Yeshua was born, the angel said, hey, he's going to be the glory of Israel and a light to the Gentiles. So he's going to bring them all in. But one of the things that we talked about, because again, we're speaking from a messianic perspective, and I think that there are some questions that we will wrestle with till the day we die as a messianic community. And I think there are some questions that the Bible does definitively answer that we shouldn't wrestle with anymore. Of course, one of those things that we talk about a lot here on MessianTics is the question of Gentiles in the movement. We were talking about the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts, and that kind of moved into Romans, where I said, I think that when we talk about what happened in the Jerusalem Council, I think the apostles had a very, very daunting task that they probably felt like they weren't prepared for, which is probably anybody in ministry. Like, I'm not ready for this, but they're dealing with something, all these Gentiles coming in, and they're building a framework. I don't think they were answering questions that day about, don't let Gentiles do this, they don't need to worry about this, forget about the Torah, whatever. They just need to do these three things. That's it. I think they were building a framework that would be built on over time. However, when we move into things like Paul, when he writes Romans and he has this massive audience, and this is what Rabbi Jacob Rosenberg was talking about. He goes, sometimes Paul's writing to Jews, sometimes he's writing to Gentiles, and sometimes he's writing to everybody. And he does it in an amazing way. But what really kind of triggered, Rabbi David particularly to say, hey, hit record, was what I was talking about was, you have in Romans 9, 10, 11, Paul is saying, hey, Gentiles, this isn't all about you, okay? Don't get cocky, to quote Han Solo. Don't get cocky. Don't get cocky, because this isn't all about you, and you have to understand that God has not cast aside his people that he knew beforehand. Israel is still just as much a part of this as they were. In fact, it is through Israel stumbling and through some removal of natural branches that can also be grafted back in, though. He goes, but some natural branches were removed so some wild ones can be put in. But also, interestingly enough, a few chapters before that, in Romans 3, he says, Jewish people, are you better off? No, not at all. So what I love about Romans is, and the question it should answer is, it levels the playing field. Like, that should not be at all a question, but it's still something we wrestle with. And I'm like, why are we wrestling with the question about what to do with Gentiles when I think that Paul definitively answers that when he says, when he levels the playing field in Romans, through, I think, the Holy Spirit. And that's kind of where we're at. I don't want to expound any more on that. I've already been talking for a few minutes. I haven't started a show in a long time, usually because I like to kind of just get the train going and then jump on it. But I'm going to throw that out there, so go ahead.
So when we discuss any of the scripture, regardless of whether it's Tanakh or it's Brit Hadashah, we have to really determine two factors. One is, who's it written to? Mm-hmm. In the case of Romans, it's written, each passage or each section is written to one of four groups: Jewish believers, Jewish non-believers, Gentile believers, or Gentile non-believers. And you have to identify that. And then the other thing is, why is it being written? What's going on at this point? And so the book of Romans is largely written to the congregations in Rome concerning their relationship with the community in Israel. What authority does the community in Israel hold over the Roman community, and that extends to the temple? Does a believing community in Rome have a responsibility to pay temple taxes, to pay money into this group of people that are serving at a temple, doing sacrifices, offerings, all those things, and yet are largely run by non-believing clergy, non-believing priests? And so this discussion is going on, and in that discussion, it begins with a conversation to Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Romans 2, if you being a Jew, and it talks about them being a bad example to the Gentiles, and then as it goes further in, as Toby said, it begins to speak to the Gentiles and correct them in their relationship together with each other, with the Jewish community, with the greater community, and with the non-believing community. So Romans is all about relationship and how we qualify ourselves in those relationships. And it really speaks to some of what goes on now, which is what you're in some ways alluding to, is this separation and division that shouldn't exist in the holistic relationship of the people of God. We have a responsibility to have a relationship with the non-believing Jewish community, even though they don't yet believe in Yeshua, because through that community, one of the absolute truths is that if it wasn't for the non-believing Jewish community raising me in Judaism with an anchor to the Torah, the Tanakh, and the things that open the door to lead me to Yeshua, I would not be a believer right now. So there's a responsibility to the non-believing, the not yet Yeshua-believing Jewish community, even though they're not believers. There is a relationship that we must have with the believing Jewish community, the Messianic Jews, and there's a relationship we need to have with the non-Jewish believing community within Messianic Judaism and outside of Messianic Judaism as God brings us into a unique one new man. And just as a plug thrown out there, if you haven't read Rabbi David's book about one new man, you need to go out and get that book and read it. It's the best book on that particular subject that I've seen come out. But it's important to identify that disunity is the reason for the book of Romans.
And I just want to throw in there, just based on what you said about having a relationship with the with the non-believing Jewish community. I 100% agree, and I think the problem is, I'm just throwing it out there, just as a side note. I think there are sections or whatever or areas of Messianic Judaism where you have Messianic Jews who do seek to have those relationships or maintain them at the expense of the gospel. And I think that that's a big mistake.
Right, and that's something that Paul is very clear about,
right.
that having a relationship with the Jewish community comes through the lens of the gospel.
Right.
Not apart from or, as you said, in a priority over the gospel.
Yes. I think it's prioritized over the gospel will diminish the gospel. And not the entire Messianic community does this, but some diminish the priority of the gospel in exchange for being accepted by...
And in fairness, and
you're 100% right. There are those in the Messianic Jewish community that absolutely do this, but I want to say that for the body as a whole, this is very much a problem. Messianic Judaism has that issue, and part of it we've talked about before is the identity crisis. Like, we want to make sure Jews are happy with us because we want Jews to come to know. I actually look at it more like this. This is maybe more of a factual way. If you go to a seeker-friendly mega church, right, you go in there, they're very rarely going to say anything, preach anything, do anything that's going to stomp your toes. Right? They're not going to tell you about all the problems in your life and that they're sometimes your fault. They're not going to tell you that you got to make better choices. They're not going to tell you that. They're going to give you the fluffy, feel-good gospel story so that they can get you to emotionally respond, say a repeat after me prayer, and get wet someday. But they don't want to cause offense, because if they cause offense, you might leave. And I think in a lot of ways there are those within Messianic Judaism that treat the gospel towards the Jewish people in the same way, that it's a seeker-friendly, we don't want to hurt your feelings because then you won't want to come talk to us kind of a thing. But there are those in the church that are just, and I'm not going to throw names out, but there are entire organizations that could give a crap less about whether or not Jews come to know Messiah, as long as the Orthodox Jewish community is still their friend.
Right, and I was going to say there's two real identifiers of this, or things we see this proponent. Those within the quasi-Messianic community who deny the deity of Yeshua because they believe that the Jewish people will accept Yeshua as a Messiah, because in Judaism there are many Messiahs, and so it's just adding one more Messiah to the list of Messianic figures. And so if we reject the deity of Yeshua, then the Jewish community will accept us as part of the Jewish community. Right. And the other side is the group within the Christian world, the groups, but there's one very large one, that at their events will not even speak of Yeshua as being the Son of God, as being the Messiah, as being, in order to not offend the Jewish people that might be present or might be involved, and lose that connective relationship. So the book of Romans, while it's talking to these different groups about unity, is never proposing or promoting a unity at the cost of truth or the gospel.
Which is, I think, why Paul opens up in Romans chapter 1 with, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Paul's like, let it be known. The gospel is the power to save both the Jew and the non-Jew. So Paul opens the letter with saying, hey, Jew or non-Jew, there's only one way.
Right.
To save your soul, right?
Yeah. So I want to add a couple of things as we continue to talk about Romans. There's a few things to keep in mind, and I'm going to, again, reference something Rabbi Toby talks about a lot when he's dealing with Paul's letters, is Paul's responding to an issue. Right, and odds are that, and like for instance with Colossians, we know Paul didn't start that community. Paul had never visited that community, but Paul's disciple is the one that started it. And so the assumption is that Paul's disciple wrote a letter to him and said, hey, how do I handle this particular issue? And then Paul sent this letter, right? Rabbi Toby talks about how a lot of times when we're reading Paul's letters, Paul's addressing specific issues in specific communities, that he has an understanding of what those issues are. Somebody told him about it. Somebody communicated with him, but it's kind of like on a phone. You're in a car with somebody on the phone. Like you're in the driver's seat, you're driving along, the person in the passenger seat's on the phone. You can hear what they're responding to, whoever they're talking to. And you can make a lot of assumptions off of that. But you don't actually know what was being said on the other end of the phone, right? And so Paul's letters are one half of a conversation, and we don't know what the other half was. And to that end, what's really important is to understand that when we're reading anything biblical, but especially anything Pauline, there is context is always the key. Context, and context isn't just what you see in the chapter and verse and so on, but you're looking at textual context, you're looking at historical context, you're looking at what's going on for those particular people, what's the overarching message being said. And a lot of people like to take Paul's letters, or any of the Bible for that matter, but Paul's letters weren't written in chapter verse, right? We have that for convenience for us, again, because we are lazy, and that makes it easier to jump to a passage, right? But Paul didn't write with chapter and verse. Paul wrote a letter. I've never put chapters and verses in a letter. I've written letters and papers that were organized in an intentional way, and you start here, and as you work down the paper, you're building upon that, bringing together the total organization, but it all flows. There aren't markers in between with chapters and verses. So Paul wrote letters, and these letters were continually flowing, building a context or a concept within a context. And if you read Paul's letters from front to back all the way through, what you realize is each and every one of them have one overarching context that is the summary of what he's addressing all the way through the book, all the way through the letter, each and every one of them. So you've got to figure out what the context is that he's dealing with. What is the overarching issue at the root of what he's addressing, which is some of what Rabbi Eric was referencing earlier. What are the actual issues at the root of what he's addressing? Because every single word in that letter is addressing that contextual issue. And you can't read it outside of that. So if you go and you read Romans 2, where it seems like he's beating down on Jewish people, which he's not, but you go and you read it and you get this interpretation, you just take it by itself, you get this interpretation that Paul didn't like Jewish people anymore. But that's not what he says. That has nothing to do with it. In fact, you read Romans 1 through 8, and you stop there, and you pick up with Romans 12, you're going to have an entirely different perspective of what the book of Romans says if you leave out 9, 10, and 11. But when you read it with 9, 10, and 11 in there, you get an entirely different perspective. Because as the Rabbi Eric and Rabbi Toby said, he's jumping from this group to that group, and he specifies, I'm talking to you at this point. Right. And I want to put this out there. Romans was written likely in the latter 40s. Probably the theories are somewhere between like 47 and 49, 47 and 50. Peter writes 2 Peter about 20 years later. All right? And in 2 Peter, at the end of 2 Peter, he says, bear in mind, verse 15, bear in mind that the patience of the Lord means salvation, just as our dearly loved brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom given to him. Galatians, where Paul snaps at Peter. Galatians was written in the latter part of the 40s. And then 20 years later, Peter is writing this letter. Not Romans. But so he says, just as our dearly loved brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom given to him. So he's 20 years later, after getting beat down by Paul verbally for being a hypocrite, he's like, okay, no, listen, this dude's got stuff you got to listen to. This is important, right? And then he goes on to say, he speaks about these matters in all of his letters. Some things in them are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist, as they also do with the rest of scriptures, to their own destruction. So 20 years after Paul wrote Galatians, which Galatians was written after Romans, at least 20 years after Romans, Peter's aware, hey, there are going to be people that are going to read his letters and they're going to take whatever they want from it. Right? They're going to read it how they want to read it, rather than what Paul's actually saying, rather than what the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, is actually speaking through Paul's penmanship. Or whoever wrote it as he was dictating. But nonetheless, and so I just want to set that up. Like, in order for us to understand Romans, we have to understand it in the context Paul is talking about. And that's the case with all of Paul's letters. There's a very specific issue he is addressing above all else. And we can't just take a chapter or a couple of verses out of a passage, out of a letter, and go, oh, this is what Paul's saying here. This is, no, what is he? Now let's extract that into the rest of the book. How does that fit into the rest of the letter? Because you can't understand it by itself. It doesn't work that way.
One of the things that, as much as I would love to see in Paul's letters how he addresses, how would he address, the Messianic movement today? I mean, there's just no way of getting that, right? But what I think is problematic is, like, my wife works for a ministry. I won't name that. I'm just saying she works for a ministry in customer and client relations, and she oftentimes gets theological questions, which she actually is prohibited from answering, which is a smart policy. But she sent me a screenshot, a screen grab of an email from a client who was Gentile, and she works for a Messianic ministry. And this client said, I have a question. I'm a Gentile. My wife's a Gentile. He goes, we understand that this was a book written by Jewish people, and, most of what you hear about in the scripture is is oriented towards Judaism. He goes, the problem is that we were at a congregation recently and we were trying to participate in those things, and we received a severe rebuke from our rabbi. He goes, what are we supposed to do with that? We're trying. And that is, I know in a sense just a different way of wording something we've discussed a lot on this show. But again, I think that these are the things that the challenging things that Paul was trying to address. If it wasn't for Romans, like Rabbi David said, if it wasn't for Romans 9, 10, 11, specifically Romans 11, I think Romans 11 is kind of like the fulcrum of the whole letter, because ultimately he's building up to one tree, one God, with different branches in it, but it's one tree pulling from the same sap, not based on the Torah, not just for the Gentiles, but it's not based on the Torah for the Jews. Paul says later in Galatians, he goes, it's not based on the Torah, it's based on the promise. So we're pulling the sap from the promise, and I think that you're going to have different branches. I think you're going to have some wild branches that are not going to, want to participate in those Jewish things or Messianic Judaism, but you're going to have some like me and like Rabbi Jonathan who really want to participate in those things, not becoming Jews biologically, but wanting to participate in those things because of their genuineness and their authenticity. And you have natural branches kind of slapping your hand like, no, don't touch that. And I'm like, wait, we're part of the same tree, dude. We're in the same tree. That sap that you're pulling from is the same that I'm pulling from. Like, you're a physical child of Abraham, but I'm a spiritual child of Abraham. And I always say this, and I've said this before, I said it in a message. I said, I even think that Abraham didn't quite understand what God was telling him. When he said, Abraham, look at the stars, he goes, those are going to be your descendants. And Abraham's like, man, am I going to start popping out a bunch of kids? I don't think that's what God was saying. I think what God was saying is one day, there's going to be so many people that are going to be your children. Not all of them are going to be physical, but many of them, if not most of them, were spiritual. And I think Paul had a real issue, because I think the reason what I think Paul was doing was he had to rebuke Jewish people to let them know, this started with you, and it's been about you for much of history, but slow down. This was, God has been saying for generations that this was going to be opened up to the world. Hold on, Gentiles. And I think he had to tell Gentiles, hold on, because he knew there's so many more Gentiles in the world than Jews. There always has been, right? So it's tough. I just don't think we need to be, for me, the Messianic movement and leadership of the Messianic movement, when Gentiles come in, I'm not saying there shouldn't be managed, shouldn't be taught, but keeping them away and stuff, I'm like, you're working against what God said he was always going to do, what he told Abraham. What he told Abraham and what he's been saying in the prophets is, the nations will come, so it shouldn't be like, oh no, here, go this way, go that way, go to a church, go this way. It should be, oh my gosh, this is what the Lord said he would do, So,
right.
It's just, I wish that the response, like what my wife, when she was talking to this client, I wish the response wasn't a severe rebuke. I wish the response was the way it was in Acts. They fell down and worshiped hey, the Holy Spirit's fallen on Gentiles too. They hit the deck and said, because they knew it really is happening. Like, he really is the Messiah. It's proof that Yeshua is the Messiah. It's proof that and if Messianic Judaism can get more on the railroad tracks with this, instead of kind of like moving off the track, still moving forward, I think, but not on the tracks.
Yeah,
if they could lock in.
Some Messianic Jewish leaders seem to act as if they're totally okay with the Gentiles coming into the kingdom as long as they stay at Cornelius' house.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way of
but not come to the temple.
Right.
And that's not God's plan. That's not God's. It was never intended to be. Remember, Cornelius was faithful to come and do everything he could at the temple. He gave alms. He did all the, and that's why God sent Peter to his house. But there's a lot of leaders who are like, I'm totally okay with God filling the Gentiles with his Spirit and leading them into being part of his kingdom as long as they stay at Cornelius' household in Jaffa or Caesarea. Just don't let them come to Jerusalem. And we'll send them letters every now and then to tell them what to do.
I think one of the, not to interrupt you, but I think one of the biggest evidences that Yeshua is Messiah, talking to a non-believing Jewish person, if they say, well, what's the evidence? I said, Do you know how many people that are non-Jews worship the God of Israel? It's because of that dude. And the Bible said he would that he would be a light to the nations.
Yeah, it amazes me this time of year. And while I'm not a pro-Christmas type person, and I don't want that to be taken that way, the evidence of Yeshua's messiahship, of his reign, of who he is how many Gentiles put a display of a Jewish family in their front yards every year at this time of year. There's a unspoken honor to a Jewish family and the Jewish Messiah, even if it's not necessarily intended, but it's there.
It's there.
And that is this, like you said, it's a statement of the power of God to reach the people of the nations. And those people may better understand who their Messiah was if we would welcome them in instead of keeping them at Cornelius' house.
Right. And instead of calling them brothers, calling them honorary associates. I'm sorry. Like that's a problem. Like God doesn't call me an honorary associate. He calls me a son, just like he calls Jonathan, just like he calls Eric, just like he calls David. And I was recently listening to a Messianic commentator talking about he was answering the question: can Gentiles do Torah? Can Gentiles, believing Gentiles in Yeshua, can they perform the Torah? As in, can they do Shabbat? Can they participate? And he goes, yes, just remember though, you're a guest at the table. And I said, no, sir, you had me until you said that. And that's the problem, is that I'm not an honorary associate. I'm not a guest. I'm a son. It's the difference between, a parent that tells an adopted son, sitting along with their biological son, hey, you're my son too.
It's a difference between servant and son.
Right. That's it. It's just so simple, but.
Yeah, and I think it's clear that Paul never intended for that to be the attitude.
No, of course not.
And obviously Yeshua never did. That was never the intention. In fact, Romans 3, and I'm going to read a stretch of it here, but Romans 3:21 says, but now God's righteousness apart from the Torah has been revealed, to which the Torah and the prophets bear witness, namely the righteousness of God through putting true trust in Messiah Yeshua, to all who keep on trusting, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They are set right as a gift of his grace through the redemption that is in Messiah Yeshua. God set forth Yeshua as an atonement through faith in his blood to show his righteousness and passing over sins already committed. Through God's forbearance, he demonstrates his righteousness at the present time, that he himself is just and also the justifier of the one who puts his trust in Yeshua. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what principle? Of works? No, but by the principle of faith. For we consider a person to be set right apart from Torah observance. Is God the God of the Jewish people only? Is he not also the God of Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Since God is one, he will set right the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then nullify the Torah through faithfulness? May it never be. On the contrary, we uphold it. Or on the contrary, we uphold the Torah specifically. But so I bring that up because as I was kind of just scrolling through Romans some while I was listening to you guys talk, it's the nail on the head. Like it speaks directly to that. I think in some ways the church has used Romans as a way to preclude practice Jewish, because they read the parts they want to read that kind of stamp down the idea or perceive to stamping down the idea of honoring Torah. Right. But it's a perception. It's not actually what it says.
Yeah, and then in Romans 2, where it says, if you being a true Jew, they take that and they say, oh, we're the church. Yeah. We're now the real Jews, the true Jews, and so on.
Yeah, and so they take the verses they want that can allow them to do whatever they want, right? Well, we don't have to worry about Shabbat anymore because we're now on Sundays. That's the Jewish thing, and we're done with that, and we don't need that. And Paul says that's not a part of it anymore. And at the same time, I think the Messianic community, we like to take the verses that, and by the way, you'll hear me regularly, and I think I've said this on the show before, you'll hear me regularly use inclusive language in regards to traditional Judaism, Messianic Jewish aspects of opinion that I don't agree with, and to the church as a whole, because as a Messianic Jew, I can't separate myself in any of the three, right? I'm a part of the traditional Jewish world, whether they accept it or not. I'm a part of the church, whether I like it or not. And I'm a part of we're all a part of the same Messianic Jewish movement, whether it's theology I agree with or not, right? And so I think that where the church, we like to use this idea that Romans, we can cherry pick the passages that make our lives easier. We don't have to do all that commandment crap anymore. We can do whatever we want. At the same time, Messianic Judaism, we like to take the verses that make it seem like Paul's saying that there should be divisions and distinctions separating Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles, you can be a believer. You can be part of the kingdom as long as you're on that side of the room. And we Jews, we're going to be over here because this is how we do things. This is our thing. And I just think it's horrible. I think when we take any portion of Scripture out of context and make it say what we want, we're bastardizing the voice of God. We're changing his directives for his people. And we're affecting the lives of people and the lives of those who could be hearing about Messiah through our message. And what ends up happening is, because we all do things so vastly different, while using the same scriptures to support our opinions, we end up presenting multiple versions of the gospel to the world. Yeah. And then the world goes, well, your God must be schizophrenic.
Yeah, first I want to recognize that David just invented a word.
Probably.
Vastically.
Yep.
I like that. I'm going to start using it. Second, I wanted to say this, that there is a necessity for roles and identity.
Yes.
Paul in Ephesians 3 begins by saying, for the sake of you Gentiles. Now, these are believers he's talking to, yet he's still referring to them as Gentiles. But then he goes on and says, talking about the mystery that was made known by revelation, as I wrote before briefly, when you read this, you can understand my insight into the mystery of Messiah, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed by the Ruach to his holy emissaries and prophets. The mystery is that the Gentiles are joint heirs and fellow members of the same body and co-sharers of the promise in Messiah Yeshua through the good news. And so this is this mystery. And he goes, I became a servant of this good news. He declares that as the good news.
Right.
Of this good news by the gift of God's favor given me through the exercise of power. This favor is given to me, the very least of his kedoshim, to proclaim to the Gentiles the endless riches of Messiah. So he's declaring this place. Now, you're Gentiles. That doesn't make you lesser or less important or less gifted or less called or less in any way.
Right.
But you are Gentiles, just like some people are Italian and some people are Hungarian and some people are whatever. But then he goes on to say, this was hidden. I didn't see this. Now, it was in the Scriptures.
Yes.
But it was hidden because of the mindset of the people reading it. They couldn't see what was in plain text because of their traditions, because of what they were taught, because of their feelings, because of their identity, because of all those things. But then he goes on to say that you Gentiles, being Gentiles, are joint heirs and he says you're with us, you're brothers, as you said earlier.
Yes.
And he said, this was revealed to me so that I would reveal it to others.
And I love that the escape hatch Paul uses is, it's a mystery. So if somebody tries to argue with him, well, wait, why would God? He goes, it's a mystery. He goes, it's a beautiful mystery that's really good news. God has decided.
God is in the business of redeeming the nations to himself.
Yeah, and bringing them on the same level as his firstborn.
Right. And I think, part of me really pities Paul and them as they figure this out, because they're having to figure all this out. The Jewish people at this time, and this is where we go, throughout the New Testament, there's never a discouragement ever from continuing to observe Torah. The Jewish community has a nomos, in the sense of like the Greek word that usually gets translated into law in English that resembles Torah. It means a way of being. It's not rules and regulations, but it's like a way of existing and being and who you are. The nations coming into the faith have to acquire a new nomos, because for example, Romans at the time, Romans have a nomos. It typically involves offering incense to pagan gods and, living a illicit lifestyle of both drunken orgies and hedonism, all the things. And when they become believers, they have to acquire a new way of being, a new understanding of what it means to be. Paul and the apostles are having to balance that declaration to them by saying, you don't become Jewish, you don't become Jews, you have to become a new version of what you already are. You have to become a Roman who's
that's
new,
such a great way to say
who's made new, which is what Paul tells us. We become new creations in Messiah. And so, as they're trying to figure this out, and that's why, there are things that remain even in cultures that are heavily believers, that remain historically, like a lot of philosophers, for example. Even Paul quotes a lot of the Greek philosophers. Those things that were redeemable remain and become part of the same nomos. They become a part of the identity of we're believing Greeks, and what do Greeks like to do? They like to philosophize. And some philosophy is good, and some of it's productive and actually encourages understanding. It's able to take a lot of the ideas and beliefs of the Jewish people and actually translate them in a way that a Northern European just wasn't going to get. They was like, well, we've never dealt with Jews before, but Greeks we've dealt with. We can kind of, almost as this middleman. So there's this beautiful thing to God redeeming the nations as the nations.
Yes.
And I think it's what is, in Jewish legend, what is it, 71 nations, I think it is, that exist in the world. And Israel's not one of them. Israel is not one of the, when God creates the nations in the world, Israel is not one of them. God creates Israel. Like out of almost out of thin air. He takes Abraham. He chooses Abraham, who's already a part of a nation.
Yeah.
Says, hey, I'm going to make you, I'm giving you the promise to you and your descendants. And then the same to Jacob. And he creates a nation, and then that nation was created for the sense to deliver light to the rest of the nations who didn't have the same encounter with God, who don't have the same nomos or way of being. And they're supposed to bring those other nations to have a new nomos, to have a new way of existing, namely through that of Messiah.
Absolutely. It's so clear when you read the texts of Paul's letters, these letters that people call difficult, but if you actually read it as written in the context it's written to, the people it's written, that Paul is simply saying in the book of Romans, for instance, that God is doing a new thing with you within the confines of what was, not a new thing outside of that. And so that's why the instructions are to take up the collection and send it to Jerusalem for the temple tax. That's why he said to be to serve under those who have authority over you. Not talking about political people, but talking about the religious leadership that supervised and oversaw them, and doing so. So there's a way, Paul says, for you to be a believer within the confines of Torah, Tanakh, and the Brit Chadashah that's being given. It's not to start a new thing. It's not that God changed the page and threw out 2/3 of the Bible and started over with this new thing, but he did this renewing within the confines of what he had, and is honestly doing what was intended. He said the Torah taught this, the Tanakh taught this, that the Gentiles, you guys just didn't see it. It was a mystery to you, not to God. It didn't occur to God 2/3 the way the Gentiles should be saved. It was his plan to begin with. It occurred to Paul that the Gentiles were supposed to be brought in because of this mystery that he didn't understand, even though it was in the text.
And I'm not... I think today, in general, and I'm speaking of just in general, especially in America, not just the Messianic community, but the churches in general, we're very blessed with the country we live in as far as in general. I'm speaking generally as far as nobody stops me from going to synagogue on Saturday. Nobody stops anybody from going to church on Sunday. My wife says something very often when things get tough in life. We'll just be kind of sitting there, or we'll be maybe, kind of complaining about just maybe a tough situation or and Brooke it'll be quiet, and Brooke will say, I wish we were in like the end times. I wish it was post-apocalyptic, so my only focus could be to survive. I think we'd live better if all we were doing was survive, and we have so much. We're so blessed that brings so many other worries, and we can get so discontented, and we can get so tied up in a knot. She goes, if it was only about surviving, she goes, I think we'd do so well. And that when I think about why Paul did so well, why Messianic communities did so well, they were surviving. They were living from day to day, week to week because of persecution. Not saying, oh, bring the persecution, but when you think of to October 7th, it was such a brief window of unity, probably not fully of what it could have been, but man, it was like after October 7th, it was like amongst the supporters of Israel, it was like tight. And then of course, because of human nature, it just kind of but when the scripture says that time will come again, but I think it was that moment of severe, awful, horrible, tragic persecution on October 7th that suddenly everybody just like locked together, and but because now in general in our country, the Messianic movement, I think in general pretty blessed. The church pretty blessed, so it's almost like there's not a need to lock arms. There's not a need to put shields together, and I don't know what to do about that. I just know that I think that's I know part of the reason why I think we saw such power in Paul's day and these little congregations, because I'm saved because of some generation. It was one of those congregations that led back to 12 of those dudes. That is why I'm sitting here. And I think but when that pressure was applied in Paul's day, that's why I think Paul said, he goes, I'm a Pharisee, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. He goes, and he's not, and then he says, and all those things I count as rubbish. That doesn't mean Paul didn't love his Judaism. He did, but he was saying also, I think at the same time, if you're going to make me throw something away though, it's going to be that. When it comes down to it, the most important thing is the exceeding riches of the knowledge of knowing Messiah. Right. So I think Paul was having to push that message in that day, because he's like, I'm trying to get people saved, man, because I might die tomorrow. And he did one day. One day Paul got thrown into prison. He never made it out.
Yeah, I just had a discussion with my wife recently because we're contemplating downsizing. We've got a nice home, but it's 4 bedrooms. There's just 2 of us and so on. And so we were talking about it, and she said, wow, it'll take us months to go through all the stuff in the house to decide what we want and what we don't want.
Because you have so much.
Because we have so much stuff. Right. And then it went to, we were talking like, well, why are we even concerned about those things? Is there anything in our house our kids actually want? Like, they have their own houses, their own stuff, their own things. And there may be a few things, but the vast majority of the stuff in our house has meaning to us, and it doesn't have any meaning to our children.
He was going out of country. This was probably maybe 10 years ago or so. He was going out of country for something and decided he needed to update his will. And he calls me up. He goes, "Hey, I'm trying to update my will because I'm going out of the country, and just in case something happens." He was like, "So I wanted to ask you, when if I die, like I want to see if you'd be okay if I put it in the will that we give you our house, and you and Danielle and the kids can move in our house." And I went, "I don't want to be in Pensacola. Don't give me your house. Like, leave it for Andrew and I, and we'll sell it and split it or something. But I'm not moving to Pensacola."
No, they want the frame. They want the big frame picture of your
rent it out or something.
But the reality is that in doing that,
Applebee's
we realized.
Stained glass.
Yeah, that's right. That Applebee's stained glass window.
That's true. I forgot all about that.
But
can you put me in your will? I want the Applebee's thing.
Okay, you guys heard it. Jonathan wants the Applebee's glass. So, but the reality is, most of people,
I feel like now you got to take a picture of it and post it on the podcast socials.
I'll do it. But most of the things, most of the people in the world don't sit down and say,
Yeah.
It'll
All my
take us
stuff.
months to go through our stuff to determine what we actually want to keep.
Yeah.
And, I've told people before, talking about Israel trips, if you go through your house and anything you haven't used in 2 years, you can probably sell it for enough money to help you go to Israel.
Yeah.
We in America are blessed. And I'm not complaining about that
No.
or demeaning that in any way.
There's an unintended consequence.
But it is true that we have ties to things that become real to us in ways that people in other nations don't have that. Like the people in Syria right now, the believers in Syria, they're not concerned with the stuff in their house. They're not concerned with all that. They're concerned with, am I going to be alive tomorrow?
Yeah, which is why I think the Spirit moves in such tangible, powerful ways there.
Right.
And as an aside, because this is a really important conversation, the reality is, as Rabbi Toby said, the what spawned this little like side quest conversation here was Brooke, his wife, saying something to the effect of, I wish that it was like post-apocalyptic sometimes, his life would just be easier,
like we were in an episode of Walking Dead.
Yeah, we have less to worry about, whatever.
Yeah.
Look, and this may seem like an odd conversation to a lot of people, but the truth of the matter is if you watch what's happening in the Middle East right now, and not just physically in Israel with the war against Hamas and Hezbollah and so on, but you watch the Middle East, like things are potentially going to be picking up rather rapidly prophetically. And I'm not saying like it's time to start putting up billboards or anything, but there's stuff to watch for. Like Syria's fall, Damascus's fall
I think
is
before
a huge.
I think before we get into that statement, we should just say thanks for watching and listening to this episode, and save the next statement for a follow-up episode and encourage people to listen to it, because there are a lot of things that are happening prophetically, or that could be prophetic in the world, but not enough that we're going to fit them into 10 minutes in the end of this conversation.
Can be the next one.
So the next episode we'll probably dig into the Damascus mystery.
So before we hit the end of this episode, I want to just kind of throw out if you could kind of surmise briefly what one of the most important aspects of the book of Romans is to you in maybe 2-3 minutes, what would that be?
I think to me, Romans is one of the strongest books against replacement theology there is in the Bible, and not just replacement theology among Gentiles and Jewish believers, but our connection to the greater Jewish community, the traditions handed down to us, and those things that hold us and bind us together through what we would call halakha, or the way we walk out our faith. Rabbi Jonathan?
Just that, Romans is both an admonishment and an encouragement. Gentiles,
Sounds like Isaiah.
it's a Jewish thing.
It's almost like God has a pattern.
It's a warning. Be cautious of how you view yourself. Gentiles don't view yourself with as though because we see and we see
like as inferior.
Well, don't see yourself as inferior, but also don't look at the Jewish world who, again, for as many Jewish believers as there also were many who just said no to Yeshua and said, we're not having anything to do with that. Don't look at you being brought in as if somehow now you're better than the Jewish world. God can easily graft them back on as easily as he broke them off. So actually instead fear God, and love and obey him, because just as easily as he casts them aside for their unbelief, he can cast you aside. So, it's a warning. But it's also an encouragement that you are Gentiles becoming new things. You now have to learn to be a new creature. You are Roman without being Roman. You are Greek without being Greek. You are Syrian without being Syrian. And what does that look for you? Well, it starts with Messiah, and we'll go from there.
The kingdom isn't hyphenated.
For me, it's the leveling of the playing field, as we said earlier. I think one of the most beautiful and probably controversial for his day statements that Paul made is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Because he's the God of Israel, right? But God is saying he's the God of every single person on this earth. And again, it just speaks to that leveling of the playing field that I think culminates in one of the most beautiful parables in Scripture, which is the olive tree. Mm-hmm. The olive tree is so important. And just as a side note, I think, again, because Paul addresses so much, but I have to say Romans 7, even though that is a little off topic, I just love that Paul is very honest about his struggle with personal sin from day to day. And I think he speaks, you can almost just hear the groaning and the despair when he writes Romans chapter 7. So there's something for everyone in the book of Romans, whether you're Gentile, Jewish, yep, or just the struggling believer every day. But to go back to stay on point, it's just that Romans levels the playing field in such a powerful way, and Paul backs it up with so much scripture. He doesn't just say, hey, we're all the same, guys. He goes, hey, listen, this is what God always intended. Okay, and as Rabbi Eric said, and it is a mystery. So Paul explains as much as he can, but then Paul says, hey, to me, it's a mystery. Like Paul says, I'm in awe of what God has done. And Yeah, and then for me, I think it's Romans is focused on relationship and unity in the body. And in that, having relationship and unity outside the body for the purpose of the Gospels, to draw people in. And for me, I see an interesting kind of painting of biblical and human history as we look through it, as you have the nations brought forth from Adam and Eve. So you end up getting the 70 nations, and from the 70 nations, God brings one person out to whom he gives a blessing for all the nations to be blessed through. And then that brings us to the nation of Israel and the Jewish people, through whom God brought Messiah, who is that blessing, that seed of promise and blessing spoken to Abraham, so that he could then put that blessing that he took this one family out from all the nations back into all the nations through that one family. And so it's this imagery that we see throughout the Bible, but in particular throughout Romans, that the message of salvation was to the Jew first and also to the nation. So the Jews are to bring it to the nations, and then the nations are supposed to bring it to the Jews. And it's this idea that we work together for each other, not work together for the kingdom as long as we stay on our side of the line. Right. But we're supposed to work together for the kingdom as one people, as one bride for Messiah, a bride made up of Jews and the nations who are made into something new that's not all that new. I love that imagery, and that Paul kind of surmises in a lot of ways the totality of the message of the gospel that goes way before Matthew. It goes all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and realistically all the way back to the fall in the garden. But it goes back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that seed of promise which is fulfilled in Messiah for all the nations to be blessed through this one family of blessing. So with that said, we appreciate you joining with us today. We hope this was a enjoyable episode for you, and if you have any feedback, please feel free to throw it our way.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.